The Galactic Council thought we were soft, a race of smooth-skinned diplomats who traded grain, negotiated trade tariffs, and smiled far too much. They didn't understand that our smiles were bared teeth. They didn't know that beneath our pressed wool suits and polite, measured nods, 100,000 years of apex evolution was just waiting for an excuse to wake up. Then the blast doors blew inwards, and in the span of 3 seconds, the council finally saw what a human looks like when the leash snaps. The synthetic leather chair squeaked. It was a high, irritating friction sound that rubbed against the back of Thomas Miller's wool trousers every time he shifted his weight, and he had been shifting his weight a lot. For the last 4 hours, the Grand Assembly Chamber of the Galactic Coalition had felt less like the beating heart of interstellar governance, and more like a poorly ventilated waiting room in a municipal tax office. The air was dry, aggressively recycled, and smelled faintly of ozone and decaying fruit, the natural pheromone excretion of the avian-reptilian hybrids that made up the majority of the ruling caste. Thomas pressed the pad of his thumb against his index finger, feeling the rough edge of a hangnail. He picked at it, a tiny grounding pain in a room drowning in bureaucratic anesthesia. "Representative Miller," the translated voice murmured in his earpiece. The voice belonged to Magistrate Cole, a Western moniker adopted purely for the human's convenience. Cole was a towering, spindle-limbed creature with pale, translucent skin and eyes that blinked laterally. "The human delegation's proposal regarding the asteroid belt in Sector 4 is emotionally compelling, but practically, your species lacks the physical fortitude to maintain the deep core extraction facilities without extensive coalition support." Thomas didn't sigh. He wanted to, but he knew how it translated. To the coalition, a sigh was a hiss, a sign of aggression or instability. Instead, he forced his facial muscles to relax into a smooth, neutral mask, the diplomat's mask. "We appreciate the magistrate's concern," Thomas said, his voice level, carrying the dull, soothing baritone he used specifically for these meetings. "However, our automated systems have been upgraded to offset the physical demands." Beside him, David Ross, the delegation's chief scientific advisor, shifted nervously. David was sweating. The harsh, blue spectrum light of the chamber was unkind to the human complexion, making David look sickly and pale. He took a sip of water from a plasteel thermos, the ice clinking against the sides. The sound was deafening in the cavernous room. "Automated systems fail," Cole replied, leaning forward. Its mandibles clicked in a rhythm that the translator smoothed out into a patronizing hum. "And when they do, your frail physiology becomes a liability. Your bones are porous. Your skin tears on contact with standard industrial abrasives. You are a fragile species, Thomas. We must protect our investments." Fragile. Thomas tasted a sudden, sharp acidity in the back of his throat. He swallowed it down. The coalition didn't understand humans. They categorized species by their physical presentation. Cole's people had exoskeleton plating and venom sacs. The security guards flanking the chamber doors, hulking quadrupedal brutes known as the Skarn, possessed natural armor that could deflect low-yield plasma. Humans, with their soft pink skin, forward-facing eyes, and lack of claws, were classified as herbivore-adjacent, prey, smart prey that had managed to build ships, sure, but prey nonetheless. Thomas glanced toward the rear exit. Sophia Brown stood there, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. As the chief of security for the human delegation, she wore a standard-issue charcoal suit, but the way she filled it was different. Her posture was relaxed. Yet her eyes, dark, calculating, restless, tracked every micro-movement in the room. She caught Thomas's eye, a fractional tightening of her jaw. She was bored too, but the bad kind of bored. The kind of bored that made the hair on Thomas's arms stand up. "We assure the Council," Thomas said, forcing the warmth back into his tone, "that humanity is fully capable of bearing the weight of our own ambitions." He hated the words as they left his mouth. They felt weak, they felt like begging, but that was the job. Smile, nod, let them think you're soft so they don't look too closely at the teeth. The air scrubbers above them kicked on with a low, vibrating hum, struggling to clear the heavy, fruity stench of alien condescension. Thomas closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the dull, throbbing ache of a tension headache blooming behind his temples. He just wanted to go back to his quarters, take off the stiff collar of his shirt, and drink a glass of synthetic whiskey that burned all the way down. He opened his eyes. The hum of the scrubbers was getting louder. No, not louder. Higher. The pitch was changing, stretching into a thin, metallic whine that vibrated in the marrow of Thomas's jawbone. He looked at David. The scientist was staring down at his water glass. The water wasn't just trembling. It was vibrating in concentric, jagged rings. Thomas looked back at Sophia. She was no longer slouching. She was standing dead center in front of the exit, her hand hovering a millimeter above the concealed holster beneath her blazer. The heavy scent of decaying peaches in the air suddenly vanished, instantly replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of ionized air and burning insulation. "Magistrate," Thomas said, interrupting the alien mid-sentence. His diplomatic baritone was gone. His voice was suddenly flat, hard, and devoid of warmth. "Get down." Magistrate Cole blinked its lateral eyelids, a gesture of profound irritation. "Representative Miller, I do not tolerate interruptions during a formal—" The explosion didn't make a sound at first. It was a pressure wave, a brutal invisible fist that punched the air out of the room. Thomas felt his eardrums bow painfully inward. The impact hit his chest cavity, rattling his ribs against his lungs. Then came the noise, a deafening concussive crack that tore through the sterile silence of the chamber. The massive plasteel blast doors at the far end of the hall buckled inwards, glowing a violent, blinding cherry red before rupturing completely. Shrapnel the size of transport shuttles screamed through the air. One jagged piece of molten metal sheared through the central podium, missing Cole by inches, and slammed into the far wall, burying itself deep into the synthetic marble. The blue spectrum lights flickered, died, and were instantly replaced by the harsh, pulsing crimson glare of the emergency strobes. Pandemonium. The council broke. Decades of refined bureaucratic conditioning evaporated in a single second. The alien dignitaries, for all their supposed superiority, reverted to their base instincts. The avian reptilians shrieked, a terrible, ear-piercing sound that echoed off the high ceilings as they scrambled over their desks. They trampled each other. Claws tore into silk robes. Exoskeletons crunched under panicked weight. It was a stampede. The mindless, frantic geometry of prey trying to escape a predator. Thomas didn't move, not at first. He stayed in his squeaky synthetic leather chair. A heavy layer of pulverized concrete and grey dust rained down from the ceiling, coating his shoulders. His heart rate had spiked at the initial blast, slamming against his ribs like a trapped bird. But then, an ancient, terrifying piece of biological machinery deep within his hindbrain clicked into gear. The panic didn't rise, it fell. It dropped into a cold, freezing well at the bottom of his stomach. His heart rate slowed down. Thump, 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 a steady, deliberate rhythm. The adrenaline hit his bloodstream not as a chaotic flood, but as a hyper-focused chemical cocktail. The headache behind his temples vanished. The dull aches in his lower back faded to zero. The world around him seemed to decelerate. He tasted copper on his tongue. He smelled the scorched carbon of the explosives, the acrid smoke of burning wires, and beneath it all, the sudden, overwhelming stench of alien terror, a sour, milky odor that cut through the dust. "Thomas!" David screamed. The scientist was on his knees, his hands clamped over his ears, his eyes wide with blind, paralyzing panic. Thomas looked toward the breached doorway. Through the thick, settling smoke, heavy silhouettes moved. They weren't the coalition's Skarn guards. They were larger, broader, covered in thick, rusted composite armor. Mercenaries, the Outer Rim syndicate known as the Wreck, six-limbed, heavily muscled brutes that communicated in guttural barks. They carried kinetic slug throwers, heavy, brutal weapons designed for maximum tissue damage. A Wreck mercenary stepped through the rubble, raised a heavy rifle, and fired into the panicked crowd of diplomats. The noise was staggering. A wet, tearing sound followed as an alien ambassador was physically torn in half by the heavy kinetic rounds. Violet blood sprayed across the pristine white floor, slick and bright under the red emergency lights. The Skarn guards, finally shaking off the concussive shock, raised their plasma rifles. They were disciplined but slow. The Freck moved with terrifying, practiced efficiency. Two mercenaries flanked the door, laying down a suppressing field of fire that shredded the Skarn guards before they could pull their triggers. The air filled with the stench of vaporized alien flesh and burning bone. It was a slaughter, a calculated, closed-room execution. Thomas stood up. He didn't make a conscious decision to do so. His body simply recognized that sitting meant dying. He reached down, grabbed the collar of David's jacket, and hauled the heavier man to his feet with a surge of hysterical strength he didn't know he possessed. "Move," Thomas growled. He shoved David toward the heavy, overturned oak table that had served as the human delegation's desk. They collapsed behind it just as a line of kinetic slugs chewed through the space they had occupied a microsecond before. Wood splinters rained down on them. Thomas pressed his back against the shattered wood. He was breathing through his nose, slow, measured. He looked at his hands. They weren't shaking. They were perfectly, unnervingly still. Across the room, through the chaos and the strobe lights, he saw Sophia. She had her sidearm drawn, a compact, high-velocity human weapon. She wasn't running with the flock. She was moving laterally, using the decorative marble pillars as cover, bounding from shadow to shadow with a fluid, terrifying grace. She didn't look like a security chief anymore. She looked like a wolf circling a wounded herd. "We are soft," Thomas thought, a bitter, cynical smile touching the corner of his lips. "We are so terribly soft." A heavy, booted footstep crunched on the debris near their overturned table. The ground vibrated. A shadow fell over them. Thomas looked up. A wreck mercenary towered over the barricade. The creature's lower mandibles were parted, revealing rows of serrated, yellowing teeth. It smelled like wet sulfur and rotting meat. It leveled the barrel of its slug thrower directly at David's trembling head. There was no time to negotiate. There were no trade tariffs to leverage. Thomas Miller, the polite, tired diplomat, closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, let the leash snap, and went to work. The shift was absolute. It wasn't a burst of heroic fury. It wasn't a valiant roar. It felt like a sheet of ice sliding down the back of Thomas's neck. All higher reasoning, all diplomacy, all linguistic processing centers in his brain abruptly shut down, rerouting all available power to the basal ganglia. Survive, neutralize, destroy. The wreck mercenary's finger tightened on the trigger mechanism. Thomas moved. He didn't rise to his feet. He launched himself from a coiled crouch. Humans were small, yes, but that meant their center of gravity was compressed. They were dense. They were built for gravity wells that crushed other species. Thomas's left hand shot upward, grabbing the scorching hot barrel of the slug thrower. The metal blistered the skin of his palm instantly, a sharp, searing pain that barely registered through the flood of endorphins and adrenaline. He yanked the weapon downward with violent, tearing force. The mercenary, unprepared for the sheer kinetic torque from such a frail creature, stumbled forward, thrown off balance. The gun fired, the deafening blast discharging harmlessly into the floorboards, kicking up a spray of pulverized wood and dust. Thomas didn't let go of the barrel. He used it as leverage, pulling himself up and forward, stepping directly into the creature's guard, close quarters, where the long, heavily armored limbs of the alien were useless. With his free right hand, Thomas didn't punch. Punching armor would shatter his knuckles. Instead, his fingers curled into a rigid, claw-like strike. He drove the heel of his palm upward, burying it into the soft, unarmored cartilage beneath the wreck's lower mandibles. The impact jarred all the way up Thomas's arm, sending a shockwave into his own shoulder. He felt something tear in his rotator cuff. He didn't care. The mercenary choked, dropping the weapon as its hands flew to its throat. It let out a gurgling, wet wheeze, but it was huge, and it wasn't dead. The wreck backhanded Thomas. The blow caught him in the ribs. The sheer mass of the alien sent Thomas flying backward. He slammed into a marble pillar, the breath exploding from his lungs in a ragged gasp. He hit the floor hard, tasting blood. He had bitten through his own cheek. For a second, the world spun. The red light smeared into a continuous ribbon of color. "Get up!" The instinct was a physical scream in his muscles. "Get up or die!" Thomas rolled. A heavy, booted foot smashed into the marble where his head had just been, cracking the stone. Thomas scrambled to his hands and knees. His hand brushed against something cold and sharp on the floor. It was a jagged 2-foot shard of the shattered plasteel table leg. It was heavy, dense, and ended in a vicious point. The wreck loomed over him, its multiple eyes narrowing in fury, reaching down to crush the human skull. Thomas gripped the plasteel shard. He didn't think about the treaties. He didn't think about the coalition's laws against lethal force. He pushed off the floor, driving his legs with every ounce of kinetic energy his evolutionary ancestors had used to run down prey on the savannas. He tackled the alien around its thick waist, driving his shoulder into its gut. Using his momentum to topple the giant backward, they crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Thomas ended up on top, straddling the beast's chest. The wreck thrashed, its powerful arms coming up to crush him. Thomas raised the plasteel shard in both hands. His face was devoid of expression. His pupils were dilated so wide, his eyes looked entirely black. He was breathing in short, sharp hisses through his nose. He drove the shard down. It struck the armor plating and slipped, slicing a shallow gash across the alien's shoulder. The wreck roared, bucking wildly. It managed to wrap one massive, scaly hand around Thomas's throat. The grip was like an industrial vice. The air supply cut off instantly. Pressure built behind Thomas's eyes. Darkness fringed the edges of his vision. No. Thomas didn't pry at the hand choking him. He didn't struggle for air. He ignored the suffocating panic. Total, terrifying hyper-focus. He gripped the plasteel shard again. He looked at the wreck's face. He found the unprotected cluster of sensory organs, its eyes. He brought the shard down again, hard. The resistance was momentary, a sickening wet pop followed by the crunch of breaking cartilage. The alien's grip on Thomas's throat instantly went slack as its roar turned into a high, keening shriek of unimaginable agony. Thomas didn't stop. He pulled the makeshift weapon out and drove it down again and again. Brutal, mechanical efficiency. He felt the warm, thick spray of sulfur-smelling blood coat his hands, his face, his white collared shirt. He felt the jarring vibration of the impacts rattling his own teeth. He kept striking until the massive creature beneath him stopped twitching. He sat there for a moment, straddling the corpse. His chest heaved, sucking in ragged, oxygen-starved breaths. The air was filled with smoke, blood, and the wailing of the dying. Slowly, the tunnel vision receded. The ringing in his ears faded, replaced by the chaotic noise of the battle still raging in the chamber. Thomas wiped the slick, alien blood from his eyes with the back of a bruised, trembling hand. He looked up. Not 10 feet away, Magistrate Cole was huddled behind a shattered podium. The tall, elegant alien was curled into a pathetic, shivering ball. Cole was staring at Thomas. The alien's lateral eyes were wide, fixed on the human diplomat in absolute paralyzing horror. Cole wasn't looking at a frail, soft herbivore anymore. Cole was looking at a creature soaked in blood, chest heaving, holding a jagged spike over a mangled corpse. Cole was looking at a monster. Thomas stood up. His ribs screamed in protest. His left arm hung limply at his side. He let the bloody plasteel shard drop to the floor. It hit with a heavy, wet thud. He spat a mouthful of blood onto the pristine white marble. He looked at Cole, his eyes dead and cold. "Automated systems fail, Magistrate," Thomas whispered, his voice a hoarse, ragged scrape. "We don't." A burst of kinetic fire echoed from the far side of the room. Thomas turned. Sophia was moving. She had flanked the remaining wreck mercenaries. The sharp, rapid crack, crack, crack of her sidearm was precise, methodical. She wasn't just shooting, she was executing them. Center mass, head, the deadly, terrifying rhythm of human warfare. Thomas bent down, picked up the dead wreck's heavy kinetic slug thrower with his good arm. It was heavy, almost too heavy to hold with one hand, but the adrenaline was a hell of a drug. He checked the action, racked the bolt, and racked a heavy round into the chamber. The metallic clack was the most comforting sound he had heard all day. He didn't run toward the fight. He walked, slow, deliberate, and utterly silent, a predator moving through the smoke, ready to remind the galaxy exactly why humanity had survived the dark. The heavy slug thrower was a clumsy, brutal piece of engineering. Thomas held it tucked hard against his hip, his good right arm wrapping around the bulky receiver. The grip was designed for a hand with 4 thick digits and a double thumb. He had to stretch his index and middle fingers together just to reach the heavy firing lever. The metal was pitted, cold, and smelled of gun oil and old copper. He moved through the smoke. His leather dress shoes, polished that morning by a mechanical valet, crunched over broken glass and fragments of bone. He kept his knees bent, lowering his center of gravity. He didn't hug the walls. Walls in a firefight were just backstops for shrapnel. He moved through the chaotic clutter of overturned desks and shattered podiums, using the uneven terrain to mask his approach. The air in the chamber was thick and hot, choking the lungs. The environmental scrubbers had completely failed, leaving the room stagnant with the stench of the dead. It was a butcher's floor. To his left, a Skarn guard lay on its back. Its thick, chitinous chest plate had been caved in by a heavy kinetic round. Bubbling, pale green fluid leaked from its mandibles. It let out a soft, clicking whimper. Thomas didn't stop. He couldn't. Empathy was a luxury of peacetime, and peacetime had ended 10 minutes ago. He spotted Sophia. She was crouched behind the ruined base of a massive decorative water feature. The water had drained out, mixing with dust to form a slippery grey mud across the marble. She dropped an empty magazine onto the floor. It hit with a flat, hollow clatter. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, Thomas noted, but from the massive, toxic dump of adrenaline flooding her system. She slammed a fresh magazine into the grip of her sidearm, racked the slide, and took a short, sharp breath. There was a nasty gash above her left eyebrow, the blood running down the side of her face and soaking into the collar of her white shirt. Thomas stepped into the shadow behind the water feature. Sophia pivoted, raising her weapon instantly, the muzzle stopping dead center on Thomas's chest. Her eyes were wide, feral. It took a fraction of a second for her brain to override the trigger pull. She lowered the gun, letting out a breath that sounded like a hiss. "You look like hell, Mr. Ambassador," she whispered, her voice tight. "Diplomatic immunity," Thomas rasped. He tasted blood again. He spat it out into the grey mud. "Status." Sophia wiped the blood out of her eye with the back of her wrist, smearing it across her forehead. She peeked around the cracked stone. 3 left. They're clustered by the main security terminal near the blast doors, trying to override the lockdown. If they crack it, they open the main promenade. We get reinforcements, or they let the rest of their boarding party in. "We can't bet on reinforcements," Thomas said. He leaned his back against the stone, feeling the cold seep through his ruined suit jacket. His ribs were a solid, burning band of agony every time his chest expanded. The coalition security forces are mostly Skarn and low-caste reptilians. They rely on numbers and intimidation. They have never fought an enemy that pushes back. They'll wait for a tactical response unit that is probably 30 minutes away. Sophia looked at the massive wreck weapon in his hand. She looked at his face, smeared with alien blood, his eyes dark and empty. "You took down a wreck in hand-to-hand." He was distracted. Right, she didn't press it. The absurdity of a human bureaucrat beating an 8-foot armored mercenary to death wasn't something they had time to unpack. "That cannon you're holding, you know how to fire it? Pull the lever, hold on tight," Thomas said flatly. "It fires high-density tungsten slugs," Sophia warned. "The recoil is meant for a creature that weighs 800 pounds. It might tear your arm out of the socket." "My left shoulder is already gone," Thomas said, gesturing vaguely to his limp left arm. "Might as well match." A heavy spray of kinetic fire tore into the top of the water feature above them, showering them in pulverized stone and water droplets. The remaining mercenaries were laying down suppression fire. They were disciplined. They knew they were hunted. "They're covering the terminal," Sophia said, raising her voice over the ringing in their ears. "I can't get an angle with the sidearm. Their armor is too thick for 9mm unless I hit the neck or the eye joints. I need them distracted, and I need them broken out of their defensive formation." Thomas looked down at the slug thrower. It was a crude, brutal tool. It didn't require finesse. It just required someone willing to pull the trigger. "I'll give you a window," Thomas said. He shifted his grip on the weapon. The blistered skin on his left palm tore open as he forced his deadened hand to support the heavy barrel. Pain flared, sharp and white-hot, cutting through the adrenaline fog. He ground his teeth together. 3 seconds, Sophia said, her eyes locked on his. The cynical, bored security chief was gone. This was the soldier, the apex predator coordinating a pack hunt. You give me 3 seconds of absolute chaos, Thomas, and I will put them in the ground. Understood. Thomas closed his eyes, taking one deep, ragged breath. He pictured the layout of the room. He pictured the distance to the terminal. He did the grim, internal calculus of violence. He opened his eyes. They were cold. Go! He growled. Thomas stepped out from cover. He didn't peek. He didn't hesitate. He stepped fully into the open aisle, planting his feet wide on the slick marble, bracing his body against the inevitable kinetic backlash. 60 feet away, the 3 wreck mercenaries turned. Their massive, armored heads swiveled toward the solitary human standing in the red emergency lighting. For a split second, they didn't shoot. The sheer, suicidal audacity of the soft-skinned diplomats stepping into their line of sight caused a momentary glitch in their tactical processing. Thomas didn't give them a chance to recover. He squeezed the firing lever. The weapon didn't just fire, it detonated. The noise was a physical blow, a concussive shockwave that instantly blew out whatever remained of Thomas's hearing. A massive, blinding muzzle flash illuminated the smoke-filled chamber in stark, strobe-like white. The recoil hit him like a runaway freight train. The butt of the weapon slammed into his right hip and stomach. He felt something crack deep in his pelvis. His boots slid backward on the marble, squealing against the stone, but he held the trigger down. Chunk, 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 chunk. The weapon cycled with monstrous mechanical violence. Huge, heavy casings, the size of brass pipes, ejected from the side, clanging against the floor. The tungsten slugs crossed the distance in a microsecond. The first Freck, the one actively typing at the security terminal, caught 3 rounds directly in the chest. The rusted composite armor designed to deflect plasma simply shattered under the sheer kinetic mass. The mercenary was lifted entirely off its feet, its chest cavity pulverized, and slammed backward into the terminal console, shorting it out in a shower of blue sparks. The other 2 mercenaries roared, raising their weapons, struggling to track the human through the blinding flash of his own suppressing fire. That was their mistake. They focused on the loudest, most aggressive threat in the room. They forgot the wolf in the shadows. Sophia broke cover, sprinting laterally across the room with terrifying, silent speed. She didn't fire while moving. She stopped, planted her feet, raised her sidearm in a perfect, rigid isosceles stance, and fired. Crack, crack. 2 shots. Precise, methodical. The rounds found the unarmored, flexible joint between the second Rex helmet and its chest plate. The mercenary dropped its gun, clutching its throat as dark, sulphurous blood sprayed into the air. It collapsed to its knees, drowning in its own fluids. The slug thrower in Thomas's hands clicked empty. The firing pin struck a vacant chamber with a heavy, hollow thud. The recoil had pushed him back 3 feet. His right arm was numb, screaming with nerve pain. He let the massive weapon drop to the floor. His chest heaved. He was entirely exposed. The third and final wreck mercenary looked at its dead comrades, then locked its multiple eyes on Thomas. It didn't raise its rifle. It tossed the weapon aside, let out a guttural, terrifying screech, and charged. It crossed the distance incredibly fast, 800 pounds of armored muscle and teeth bearing down on a broken human. Thomas stood his ground. He had nothing left to fight with. His left arm was useless. His right hand was trembling so hard he couldn't make a fist. But the cold, freezing well of his survival instinct didn't allow him to run. He just watched the monster come, his jaw locked, eyes dead and unblinking. 10 feet, 5 feet. Sophia stepped into the aisle. She didn't shout. She just raised her pistol. Crack. The 9mm round blew out the charging Freck's left kneecap. The leg buckled instantly. The massive creature's own momentum betrayed it, sending it crashing violently into the marble floor. It slid, the metal armor grinding against the stone in a shower of sparks. It came to a halt less than 2 feet from Thomas's blood-spattered shoes. The wreck snarled, reaching out with a massive, scaly hand to crush Thomas's ankle. Sophia walked up behind it, placed the muzzle of her pistol against the back of its skull, right where the armor plating gave way to thick, leathery skin, and pulled the trigger. The creature's head snapped forward. Its heavy hand dropped to the floor, inches from Thomas's foot. It stopped moving. Then there was silence. It wasn't a true silence. The emergency strobes were still spinning, casting long, bloody shadows across the room. The air scrubbers were emitting a dying, high-pitched whine, and from beneath overturned tables and shattered debris came the soft, pathetic whimpering of the surviving Galactic Council. Thomas stood over the dead wreck. His chest rose and fell in jagged, painful increments. He felt cold, so deeply, profoundly cold. The adrenaline was beginning its vicious retreat, leaving behind a body that was battered, broken, and running on fumes. Sophia lowered her weapon. She didn't holster it. She kept it by her side, her eyes scanning the wreckage for any signs of movement. "Clear," she said, her voice raspy, barely carrying over the hum of the broken electronics. Thomas slowly turned his head. Beneath the shattered remnants of the human delegation's desk, David Ross was crawling out. The scientist was covered in wood dust and plaster. He was shaking uncontrollably, his eyes darting frantically from the mangled corpses of the mercenaries to the two humans standing among them. David looked at Thomas. He looked at the blood coating Thomas's hands, face, and shirt. He swallowed hard, scrambling backward until his back hit a marble pillar. He was terrified of them. Thomas looked past David. Across the chamber, the alien dignitaries were beginning to peer over their hiding spots. Magistrate Cole, the tall, condescending creature who had called humanity frail less than 20 minutes ago, was pulling itself up from the floor. Cole's expensive silk robes were torn. Its pale, translucent skin was smeared with soot and the blue blood of a dead avian reptilian nearby. Cole looked at the blast doors, blocked by the massive corpses of the wreck. Then Cole looked at Thomas and Sophia. The alien's lateral eyelids didn't blink. Its mandibles were trembling. The sheer, unadulterated horror radiating from the magistrate was palpable. It wasn't the horror of the attack anymore. It was the horror of realization. They had invited predators into their highest halls of power. They had given them a seat at the table, thinking they were domesticating a lesser species. They had looked at the humans' lack of claws, their lack of natural armor, their polite smiles, and assumed they were safe. They had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of evolution on a death world. You didn't survive a planet like Earth by growing thicker skin. You survived it by being the most violent, adaptable, and ruthless thing in the dirt. Thomas met Cole's gaze across the room. The diplomat was gone. The mask was shattered, lying in pieces on the bloody floor. Thomas didn't smile. He didn't offer a reassuring nod. He simply stared back, a tired, broken man soaked in alien blood, standing atop a mountain of meat and metal. Thomas reached into his ruined jacket pocket with his trembling right hand. He pulled out a slightly crushed white cloth handkerchief. He slowly, deliberately wiped the thick, sulphurous blood from his cheek. "Magistrate," Thomas said. His voice was a raspy whisper, but in the quiet of the graveyard, it carried like a gunshot. "About that asteroid belt. The problem with survival instincts is that they are chemically expensive. The human body is not designed to operate at maximum output for long. It takes a high-interest loan out on the nervous system, and when the threat is gone, the biology comes to collect." Thomas's hand began to shake. It wasn't a subtle tremor. It was a violent, involuntary shudder that started in his right wrist and rapidly vibrated up into his elbow. The crushed, bloody handkerchief slipped from his fingers, landing with a soft, wet slap on the ruined marble. He tried to clench his fist to stop it. His fingers refused to obey. The neural pathways were flooded, burnt out by the massive dump of cortisol and epinephrine. The cold hit him next. It seeped into his marrow, a deep, freezing ache that made his teeth chatter. The red emergency strobes painted the room in harsh, pulsing light, but all Thomas felt was a grey, suffocating chill. The pain in his chest, previously a dull pressure, suddenly bloomed into a sharp, agonizing, stabbing sensation with every shallow breath. Broken ribs, at least 2, maybe 3. His left arm was a dead, heavy weight pulling at his collarbone. The torn rotator cuff throbbed in time with his racing, erratic heartbeat. He looked at Sophia. She was leaning heavily against the shattered remains of the water feature. Her sidearm was finely holstered, but her hand rested loosely over the grip. Her face was pale, the blood from the gash on her forehead beginning to dry into a dark, crusty trail down her cheek. She caught him looking and gave a microscopic shake of her head. "Don't show them," the gesture meant. "Don't show them we're breaking." Thomas locked his jaw. He forced his shaking right hand into his trouser pocket, hiding the tremor. He stood taller, fighting the overwhelming urge to double over and vomit. Across the room, the surviving dignitaries were beginning to mobilize. It was a pathetic, chaotic sight. The avian reptilians were helping each other up, their feathers ruffled, their robes torn. They kept shooting terrified, sideways glances at the center of the room, at the dead wreck, at the humans. Magistrate Cole hadn't moved. The tall alien was still staring at Thomas, its lateral eyes wide, processing the impossible math of the last 15 minutes. A soft, herbivorous diplomat had dismantled an apex mercenary with a piece of broken furniture. It broke every fundamental law of coalition biology. A heavy, mechanical, groaning sound echoed from the far end of the chamber. The secondary blast doors, the ones the wreck hadn't breached, were manually cranking open. Through the widening gap, the flashing blue lights of coalition security forces spilled into the room. Dozens of Skarn tactical units poured in. They were heavily armored, moving in tight, overlapping phalanxes with their heavy plasma rifles raised. They looked imposing. They looked professional. They were 30 minutes late. The lead Skarn, a massive creature with reinforced chitin plating, swept its rifle across the room. It registered the dead avian reptilian diplomats. It registered the shattered podiums. Then, its optics locked onto the center of the carnage. It saw the 3 dead wreck mercenaries, and it saw Thomas and Sophia standing over them. "Drop your weapons!" The Skarn commander's voice boomed through the chamber's remaining functional audio scrubbers, translated into a harsh, metallic English. "Lie flat on the floor! Hands visible!" The entire phalanx of Skarn guards pivoted, bringing 24 heavy plasma rifles to bear on the 2 injured humans. The blue targeting lasers cut through the settling dust, painting tiny, bright dots across Thomas's ruined white shirt and Sophia's chest. Thomas didn't move. He couldn't have gotten down on the floor if he wanted to. His knees felt like they were packed with ground glass. Sophia, however, reacted. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't lie down. She stepped directly in front of Thomas, placing her own body between the coalition weapons and her bleeding ambassador. She stood perfectly straight, her chin tilted up, her eyes locked dead on the Skarn commander. She didn't reach for her gun, but her posture screamed violence. It was the stance of a creature that had just killed 3 apex predators and was perfectly willing to try for 24 more. "We are the surviving victims of a terrorist breach," Sophia said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room with absolute, frigid authority. "Lower your weapons, now." The Skarn commander hesitated. Its mandibles clicked nervously. It looked at the mangled corpses of the wreck. Mercenaries, the Skarn were notoriously terrified to engage in close quarters, and then looked back at the small, bleeding human woman demanding compliance. The cognitive dissonance paralyzed the guard. "Commander!" a voice rasped. It was Magistrate Cole. The tall alien stepped out from behind its shattered podium. Cole's voice trembled slightly, lacking its usual bureaucratic smooth edge, but it carried enough command to freeze the room. "Lower your weapons," Cole ordered, walking slowly toward the center of the chamber. It avoided stepping in the pools of thick, sulfurous blood. The human delegation neutralized the threat. The Skarn commander's heavy rifle dipped a fraction of an inch. "Magistrate, protocol dictates." "Protocol is irrelevant, Commander," Cole snapped, the stress finally bleeding into its tone. "The wreck are dead. Secure the perimeter. Call for medical triage, and get those weapons off the ambassador." Slowly, reluctantly, the Skarn lowered their rifles. The blue targeting lasers vanished from Thomas's chest. Thomas let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. The edges of his vision began to spot with black. The adrenaline was entirely gone now, leaving behind a husk of bruised meat and shattered bone. David Ross finally moved. The scientist scrambled out from behind the marble pillar, his face ghostly pale. He didn't run toward Thomas and Sophia. He ran toward the advancing medical teams, keeping a wide, fearful berth around the human security chief and the ambassador. Thomas watched him go. A bitter taste coated the back of his throat. He didn't blame David. David was a man of the new era, a man of laboratories, deep space probes, and civilized debate. He had never had to look the ancient, ugly truth of human biology in the eye. Now he had. A pair of coalition medics, small, multi-limbed creatures in sterile white suits, approached Thomas and Sophia. They moved hesitantly, their large black eyes darting nervously to the dead wreck. "Ambassador Miller!" one of the medics chirped, its translator struggling to convey a soothing tone. "Please, Sit. You are severely damaged. Thomas looked down at his ruined suit, soaked in alien blood and his own sweat. He looked at Sophia, who finally let her shoulders drop a fraction of an inch, the feral tension leaving her spine. "Yeah," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. "I think I need a chair." He didn't wait for them to offer one. He simply let his legs give out. He collapsed backward onto the cold, hard marble floor, staring up at the flickering red emergency strobes. The pain washed over him in a massive, suffocating wave, pulling him down into the dark. The medical bay smelled like ozone, bleach, and something cloyingly sweet, like rotting lavender. Thomas opened his eyes. The lights were a harsh, clinical white, burning into his retinas. He squinted, turning his head slowly. His neck felt incredibly stiff. He was lying on a biobed. The mattress was a gel-like substance that contoured unnervingly to his spine. He wasn't in his bloody suit anymore. He was wearing a thin, grey, paper-like gown. The pain in his ribs was gone, replaced by a deep, terrifying numbness. His left arm was strapped tightly against his chest in a rigid composite sling. He took a breath. It didn't hurt, but his lungs felt heavy, like they were filled with wet sand. Painkillers, heavy, alien narcotics. "You're awake." Thomas shifted his gaze to the right. Sophia was sitting in a metallic chair near the wall. She was also wearing a grey medical gown. A thick white biosynthetic patch covered the left side of her forehead, sealing the gash. She looked exhausted. The dark circles under her eyes were bruised purple. "How long?" Thomas croaked. His throat felt like sandpaper. 4 hours, Sophia replied. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "They pumped you full of a localized anesthetic block. Your ribs are set with micro splints. They had to surgically reattach your rotator cuff. The doctor said you tore it completely off the bone, said it requires a terrifying amount of mechanical force to do that to human musculature." "He sounded impressed," Thomas muttered. "He sounded terrified," Sophia corrected him, her voice flat. Thomas slowly pushed himself up with his good right arm. The gel bed protested with a wet, squelching sound. The room spun for a second before settling. It was a containment suite, not a standard hospital room. The door was made of reinforced plasteel, and there were no windows. A security camera blinked with a steady red light in the upper corner of the ceiling. "Where is David?" Thomas asked. Sophia looked away, staring at the sterile white tiles of the floor. "He requested a separate transport back to the human embassy. He didn't want to be in the same transport vehicle as us." Thomas closed his eyes. The numbness of the painkillers couldn't touch that specific kind of ache. They had saved the man's life, and now they were monsters to him. The tragedy of the sheepdog. The flock only tolerates you until you have to bite the wolf. Then they realize you have teeth too. "Let him go," Thomas said quietly. "He doesn't belong in the dark." The heavy plasteel door hummed and slid open. Magistrate Cole stepped into the room. The alien had changed out of its torn silk robes and was now wearing a severe, high-collared tunic of dark blue. The soot and blood had been scrubbed from its pale skin, but the alien still looked diminished. The condescending posture, the casual arrogance that had defined every interaction Thomas had ever had with the Coalition was entirely absent. Cole stood near the door. It didn't approach the bed. It kept a very deliberate, mathematically precise distance from the two humans. "Representative Miller, Chief Brown," Cole said. The translator earpiece relayed the words perfectly, but the underlying tone was cautious, measured. "Magistrate," Thomas replied, leaning back against the gel pillows. He didn't smile. The mask was gone for good. "The casualty reports are finalized," Cole said, its mandibles twitching slightly. 17 Coalition delegates deceased, 42 wounded. The Skarn Guard detail suffered a 90% casualty rate in the initial breach. Cole paused, its lateral eyes locking onto Thomas. The Vrek Syndicate team was entirely neutralized. 3 by kinetic projectile trauma, 1 by severe, repeated puncture wounds to the cranial and optical cavities. "They breached a diplomatic session," Sophia said coldly. "We defended ourselves." "Defended?" Cole repeated, testing the word. The alien took a slow breath. "Your physiological scans have been processed by our medical chief. The data is deeply unsettling, Ambassador. The chemical composition of your blood during the incident, the sudden, extreme density of your muscle fibers, the complete suppression of your pain receptors. Our biological models classify this state as a terminal distress response, a last, Violent spasm before death. "We call it an adrenaline rush," Thomas said dryly. "It is the biological profile of a hyper-predator," Cole stated. The alien's voice dropped, carrying a genuine vibrating edge of fear. "You masquerade as diplomats. You trade in grain and textiles. You complain about the temperature of the assembly halls. You present yourselves as soft." "We are soft," Thomas said. He gestured to his broken arm with his good hand. "My shoulder tore itself apart just from hitting something. I have 3 broken ribs. If I didn't have this nerve block in, I wouldn't be able to breathe. We're incredibly fragile, Cole." "Fragility does not mean weakness," Cole countered sharply. "Your bodies break, yes, but your minds, your psychological capacity for immediate, calculated violence. It is unprecedented. When the explosion happened, my people panicked. The avian reptilians ran blindly. It is their nature. We thought it was your nature too." Cole took half a step closer, then stopped itself. "But you didn't panic, Thomas. You didn't run. Your heart rate slowed down. You utilized a broken piece of furniture to bludgeon a fully armored wreck shock trooper to death. You engaged in a calculated tactical execution with Chief Brown. You operated with a ruthless efficiency that terrifies the Council." "Is there a question in there, Magistrate?" Sophia asked, her hand drifting unconsciously toward her hip where her sidearm usually rested. Cole looked at Sophia's empty hand, then back to Thomas. "The Council is convening an emergency session tomorrow," Cole said. "The incident will be reviewed, but the political landscape has irreversibly shifted. The Coalition no longer views humanity as a fragile, developing species that requires our protection and oversight." "Good," Thomas said. "Do not mistake my meaning, Ambassador," Cole warned. "They do not view you as equals either. They view you as an unknown variable, a threat. They realize now that sitting at a table with humanity is not sitting with a herbivore. It is sitting in a cage with a sleeping predator, hoping you do not accidentally wake it up." Thomas held the alien's gaze. He felt the cold truth of the word settle in the sterile room. Decades of careful diplomacy, of playing the polite, harmless neighbor, were gone, burned to ash in the span of 3 minutes. They were exposed. But as Thomas looked at his broken body, and then at Sophia's unyielding posture, he realized he didn't care. He was tired of smiling at aliens who thought he was prey. "Tell the Council," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly timbre that made Cole flinch, "that humanity remains fully committed to peaceful cooperation and galactic trade." Thomas leaned forward slightly, ignoring the tight pull in his stitched shoulder. "But also remind them of what they saw today. Remind them that we only smile because we choose to. And regarding that deep core extraction contract in Sector 4, Thomas let the sentence hang in the air, cold and heavy. "I expect the Coalition's approval on my desk by tomorrow morning." Cole stared at the human. The alien swallowed, a visible lump moving down its long, translucent throat. It didn't argue. It didn't mention trade tariffs or physical limitations. "I will inform the Council," Cole said quietly. The alien turned and walked out of the room, the heavy plasteel doors sliding shut behind it, sealing the humans back in their cage. But as Thomas looked at the reinforced walls, he knew the truth. The cage wasn't there to keep humanity in, it was there to keep the rest of the galaxy out. The medical discharge took another 2 hours of agonizing bureaucratic theater. The Coalition medical staff didn't speak directly to Thomas or Sophia. They spoke to the data pads in their hands, their eyes fixed firmly on the glowing screens, avoiding any direct visual contact. When a nurse, a diminutive, multi-jointed being with skin like pale blue suede, had to adjust Thomas's sling, its hands shook so violently it dropped the clasp twice. Thomas didn't try to soothe the creature. He didn't offer a polite, self-deprecating joke to ease the tension, the way he would have yesterday. He just sat still, breathing shallowly, letting the alien fumble in its terror. They were given generic, ill-fitting civilian transit clothes, stiff grey synthetic weaves that smelled strongly of chemical sanitizers. Thomas's trousers were an inch too short, exposing his bruised ankles, and the shirt pulled painfully against his injured shoulder. Sophia's tunic hung loosely over her frame, hiding the heavy bandages wrapping her ribs. When the heavy plasteel doors of the medical suite finally slid open to allow them to leave, the corridor outside was dead quiet. Usually the central transit hub of the Coalition Directorate was a chaotic, deafening mess, a constant stream of diplomats, aides, security details, and logistical drones moving in a blur of alien languages and clashing pheromones. Today, it was a ghost town. As Thomas and Sophia stepped out into the wide, vaulted hallway, the few aliens present simply stopped. A group of avian reptilian junior clerks, carrying stacks of data scrolls, froze mid-step, their feathers, usually preened and puffed to display status, flattened tightly against their scales in a universal biological display of submission and fear. They pressed their backs against the smooth metallic walls, trying to make themselves as small as physically possible. A pair of heavily armored Skarn guards stood by the elevator banks. Yesterday, they would have demanded to see human identification chips, flexing their authority over the soft species. Today, as Thomas's eyes flicked toward them, the massive quadrupedal brutes immediately lowered their heads, fixing their gaze on the floor tiles. They didn't even twitch as the two humans walked past. "Moses parting the Red Sea," Sophia murmured. Her voice was a dry, raspy scrape. She was walking with a pronounced limp now, favoring her right leg. "Except they aren't looking at a prophet," Thomas replied, keeping his voice equally low. The effort of walking upright, of maintaining a steady, even stride while his pelvis burned and his chest ached, was demanding all of his remaining focus. "They're looking at the wolf that just wandered into the pasture. Let them look." Sophia kept her hand resting casually near her hip, a phantom muscle memory searching for a sidearm the Coalition had confiscated. Better a live wolf than a dead sheep. They reached the private transit elevators. The doors hummed open automatically. The interior was lined with polished synthetic glass, reflecting their battered forms back at them. Thomas looked grey, his skin sallow and tight over his cheekbones. The bruising along his jawline from the wreck's backhand had deepened into an ugly mottled purple. The elevator began its rapid descent toward the diplomatic docking bays. The sudden shift in gravity pushed Thomas's stomach into his throat. He leaned his good shoulder against the cool glass wall and closed his eyes. "Did you mean what you said to Cole?" Sophia asked quietly. "About the Sector 4 mining contract." "I did. You blackmailed a coalition magistrate." "I leveraged a newfound geopolitical reality," Thomas corrected, opening his eyes. He looked at her reflection in the glass. "They were going to deny the contract because they thought we were too weak to hold the territory. Now, they'll approve it because they're absolutely terrified of what we might do if they say no. It's the exact same diplomatic equation. The only thing that changed is the variable." Sophia let out a short, hollow laugh that turned into a grimace of pain as her bruised ribs caught. "Diplomacy, right. I just executed 3 syndicate mercs with a 9mm, and you beat an 8-foot alien to death with a table leg. But sure, let's call it a geopolitical reality." "It has to be," Thomas said. His voice was entirely devoid of humor. "If it's not a geopolitical reality, Sophia, then it's just murder. And if it's just murder, then we really are the monsters they think we are." The elevator shuddered to a halt. The doors chimed, opening to reveal the secure docking ring. The human diplomatic shuttle, the UNS Endeavour, sat waiting on the pad. It wasn't an elegant ship. It was a blocky, utilitarian wedge of scarred titanium and heavy thruster banks. Next to the sleek, organic curves of the Coalition vessels, it looked like a crude iron anvil sitting in a jewelry case. Right now, it was the most beautiful thing Thomas had ever seen. Standing at the base of the boarding ramp was a solitary figure. It was David Ross. The scientist had a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He was fidgeting with the strap, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot. As Thomas and Sophia approached, David visibly stiffened. He didn't look them in the eye. He looked at their chests, at the floor, anywhere but their faces. "Ambassador," David said, his voice tight, formal. "Chief Brown." "David," Thomas nodded. "I thought you requested separate transport." "I did," David swallowed hard. "But the Directorate refused to issue flight clearance for a solitary human vessel. They implemented a quarantine protocol. All human personnel are to be contained to a single transport for immediate departure to our embassy sector. Containment." The word hung in the air, heavy and loaded. "They don't want us wandering the halls," Sophia noted dryly. "Understood. Get on board, Doctor." David didn't argue. He practically sprinted up the ramp, disappearing into the dark interior of the ship. Thomas and Sophia followed at a much slower pace. With every step up the incline, the alien gravity field gave way to the ship's artificial gravity plating. It was heavier. It pulled at Thomas's bones, demanding more effort, but it felt right. It felt grounded. The ramp raised behind them with a heavy hydraulic clank, sealing out the sterile, ozone-scented air of the Coalition hub. The ship's interior smelled like stale coffee, recycled machine oil, and the sharp tang of ozone. It smelled like humanity. Thomas sagged against the bulkhead. The adrenaline tax was fully due, and his account was empty. "Take us home, pilot," Sophia called out toward the cockpit. The ship rumbled to life, the deep, resonant vibration of the fusion drives rattling the deck plates beneath their feet. Thomas closed his eyes and let the machine carry him away from the graveyard he had made. The human embassy was located in Sector 7, a poorly lit, highly industrialized ring of the station that the Coalition had assigned to humanity as a subtle insult. It was loud, the air was always a little too warm, and the ambient noise of heavy machinery bled through the walls. Thomas loved it. He sat behind his heavy oak desk, real wood imported from Earth at an astronomical cost, and stared out the thick plasteel window. Beyond the glass, the neon-drenched spires of the alien station stretched out into the black void of space. It had been 6 hours since they returned. 6 hours of frantic encrypted comms with Earth Command, explaining the impossible situation. The response from the UN Security Council had been a mix of horrified silence and grim, pragmatic calculations. Humanity was no longer a junior partner. They were an isolated anomaly. Thomas reached over to his desk drawer with his right hand. His fingers were still trembling, a subtle, persistent micro-shake that the medical bay's nerve blockers couldn't touch. He pulled out a heavy crystal tumbler and a square bottle of amber liquid, Kentucky bourbon, synthesized in a vat aboard a freighter 3 systems away, but it carried the necessary bite. He poured 2 fingers with a clumsy, shaking hand, spilling a few drops onto the polished oak. He didn't bother to wipe it up. The door to his office chimed and slid open. Sophia walked in. She had changed out of the grey medical scrubs and was back in her standard-issue charcoal suit. The jacket hid her bandages, but she still moved with a stiff, deliberate caution. The white biosynthetic patch on her forehead stood out starkly against her dark skin. She walked over to the desk, pulled out one of the heavy leather guest chairs, and sat down with a slow, controlled exhale. "Earth Command is spinning up the diplomatic PR machine," Sophia said, leaning her head back against the chair. "They're drafting a statement about our regrettable but necessary defensive actions. They're trying to frame us as reluctant warriors. Will the Coalition buy it?" Thomas asked, staring at his glass. "No," Sophia said bluntly. "You can't unring a bell, Thomas. They saw us. They saw what happens when the leash snaps. You can draft all the polite press releases you want, but every time Cole looks at a human from now on, he's going to see you holding a bloody spike." Thomas picked up the glass. The amber liquid swirled, catching the harsh desk light. "David filed for a transfer," Thomas said softly. "He requested a post on an automated listening station in the Oort cloud, as far away from other people as he could possibly get." Sophia didn't look surprised. "He's a good man, but he's a peacetime man. He spent his whole life believing we had evolved past the dirt and the blood. Finding out that the caveman is still in there, just sleeping beneath a tailored suit, it broke his worldview. Did it break yours?" Thomas looked up at her. Sophia met his gaze. Her eyes were dark, tired, but completely steady. "No, I never forgot what we are, Thomas. My job is to expect the worst. My job is to know exactly where the caveman is buried, just in case I need to hand him a club." She nodded toward the bottle on the desk. "Are you going to pour one for me, or am I just here to watch you drink?" Thomas managed a tight, grim smile. He reached into the drawer, pulled out a second tumbler, and poured. He pushed the glass across the desk toward her. Sophia picked it up. She didn't toast. There was nothing to celebrate. They both drank. The bourbon hit the back of Thomas's throat like liquid fire. It burned all the way down to his bruised stomach, a sharp, grounding pain that finally cut through the lingering numbness of the alien anesthetics. He closed his eyes, savoring the harsh reality of the sensation. "So, what now?" Sophia asked, setting her empty glass down with a heavy clack. "We can't go back to playing the harmless traders. We can't go back to begging for scraps at the council table. No, Thomas agreed. He set his own glass down. He looked out the window again, at the sprawling, infinite complexity of the alien city outside. We don't beg anymore. He leaned forward, ignoring the pulling ache in his stitched shoulder. The exhaustion was still there, a heavy blanket draped over his bones, but beneath it, the cold, freezing well of focus remained. For 100,000 years, humanity survived because we knew how to adapt to hostile environments, Thomas said, his voice dropping into a low, quiet hum. We adapted to ice ages. We adapted to predators. We adapted to each other. And when we reached the stars, we looked around, saw a galaxy run by soft, bureaucratic prey, and we adapted to that. We put on suits. We learned to smile. We pretended to be harmless. Thomas looked at his right hand. The shaking had finally stopped. The fingers were perfectly, terrifyingly still. The environment just changed again, Thomas said. The masquerade is over. The coalition knows exactly what is sitting at the table with them. And what is sitting at the table? Sophia asked, watching him closely. Thomas looked up, his eyes reflecting the cold neon light of the alien station. Apex predators, Thomas whispered. Apex predators who just realize they don't have to apologize for having teeth. He reached out, grabbed the data pad containing the coalition's desperate fast-tracked approval for the Sector 4 mining rights, and keyed his signature into the bottom line. The galaxy was dark, deep, and full of terrors, but as Thomas Miller sat in the quiet of his office, feeling the slow, rhythmic beat of his own heart, he knew one indisputable fact. Humanity was the biggest terror of them all. Thanks for diving into this gritty, raw look at humanity's true nature in The Day the Council Witnessed Humanity's Predator Mode. If this visceral blend of sci-fi action and deep human survival instincts got your adrenaline pumping, show your support. Hit that like button, share this story with fellow HFY fans, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next part of this epic saga. Let me know down in the comments, what would your survival trigger look like? See you in the next video!